All right, today we're going to dive into one of the most famous and, most controversial studies in the history of psychology, the Milgram Experiment. It's a fascinating and, honestly, pretty unsettling story about authority, about conscience, and about what normal, everyday people are capable of when they're just following orders.
And we're going to start with a single number that just completely shook the world of psychology. 65%. Let that sink in. In Stanley Milgram's original experiment, 65% of regular people, folks just like you and me, were willing to give what they thought was a lethal 450-volt electric shock to a total stranger. So, that leads to the big question, doesn't it? Would you do it? Now, before you shout "no way" at the screen, you got to know this. Pretty much everyone Milgram asked beforehand, even psychiatrists, said only a tiny handful of people, like the most disturbed fringe, would go all the way. They were completely, totally wrong. So the real mystery is, why?
To even begin to understand that 65%, we have to look at what Milgram called his architecture of obedience. See, this wasn't just a simple test. Oh no, it was a brilliantly designed piece of psychological theater, built from the ground up to see just how far a person in a lab coat could push someone.
And the star of the show was this machine right here, the shock generator. It looks pretty menacing, right? It's got 30 switches, and each one ups the voltage. But the real genius, the really manipulative part, is the labels. They aren't just numbers. They tell a story of escalating pain, slight shock, then strong shock, all the way up to danger, severe shock. And then, at the very end, just 2 switches marked with a terrifying XXX. The whole thing was designed to just dial up the psychological pressure to the max.
And to make it all feel terrifyingly real, the learner, who was, of course, an actor in the next room, had a very specific script of pre-recorded reactions. It starts small, just a little grunt at 75 volts. But by 150 volts, he's yelling about a heart condition and begging to be let out. Then, after an agonized scream at 315 volts, there's just silence. And you, the participant, you're left to wonder what that awful silence really means. So what happens when a participant gets nervous and wants to stop? Well, that's when the experimenter, the calm man in the gray lab coat, starts applying pressure. He uses 4 very specific, standardized prods. He starts off nice and polite, "Please continue." But if you hesitate, it escalates. The experiment requires that you continue. And finally, the ultimate command: you have no other choice, you must go on. The point here is that these weren't random comments. They were a system designed to slowly take away your right to say no.
And this chart shows what is maybe the most powerful lesson from the whole thing. It wasn't about people being evil. It was all about the power of the situation. I mean, just look at the numbers. In the standard setup, 65% obey. But take the authority figure out of the room, have him give orders over the phone, obedience drops through the floor, down to about 20%. And now look at this. What if the participant sees 2 other people refuse to go on? It plummets to just 10%. The context, the situation, it was everything.
But here is where the story we all thought we knew gets a major twist. For decades, we had this very clean, very clear version of the experiment. But then, researchers finally got into Milgram's personal archives at Yale, and the picture that emerged was a whole lot messier, and, in some ways, even more disturbing.
You see, the audio tapes from the experiments showed that the experimenter went off script. A lot. Instead of those 4 neat prods, he'd sometimes just improvise, badgering and bullying people to keep going. I mean, in one session, he used more than 20 ad-libbed commands. That's not just authority anymore. That's just straight-up coercion.
And this is just a huge contrast. So what Milgram published was this picture of a standardized experiment where most people totally believed the shocks were real. But what the archives revealed was a different story. Many participants were actually really skeptical about the whole setup. And here's the wild part. The people who are the most suspicious that it was all fake, they were often the ones who were most likely to go all the way to 450 volts.
But there was another secret, one Milgram pretty much buried for years. He ran a version of the study he called the relationship condition. In this one, participants brought a friend or a family member with them, and through a fake drawing of lots, they were told they had to be the one to give the shocks to their loved one. So why did he basically hide this version? Well, the result tells you everything you need to know.
Just 15%. Think about that. When you replace the anonymous stranger with someone you actually know and care about, the obedience to authority just evaporates. Only 15% of people would go to the maximum voltage. This one hidden piece of data shows us that empathy might just be the ultimate kryptonite for blind obedience.
So all these discoveries from the archives have forced a huge rethinking of why people actually obeyed. Milgram's original theory, well, it's not the only explanation anymore. Let's take a look at the new way of thinking about this.
Okay, so Milgram's theory was the agentic state. The idea is that you kind of turn off your own conscience and just become an agent, a tool for the authority figure. But this newer theory, called engaged followership, says the exact opposite. It argues that people weren't mindlessly obeying. No, they were actively and enthusiastically following along because they identified with the cause. They truly believed they were helping advance science.
And the proof for this new theory? It's hiding in plain sight, right in Milgram's own data. Of those 4 prods, which one do you think was the most effective? It was this one. The experiment requires that you continue. Why? Because it appeals to that noble goal of science. And the least effective prod? The direct order, you have no other choice. That one almost always made people walk out. They weren't just cogs in a machine. They were believers in the mission.
So if we step back from the theories, what's the real, lasting impact of this experiment? It's absolutely massive. Milgram's study didn't just change psychology, it fundamentally changed how we do research and how we think about authority in some of our most important institutions.
I mean, you can draw a direct line from the ethical firestorm that erupted over Milgram's deception and the real psychological distress it caused to the creation of the ethical rulebook that protects all research subjects today. The timeline makes it crystal clear. The public outrage directly led to new laws and to something called the Belmont Report, which is now the foundation for all human research ethics.
And that report gave us these 3 pillars of ethical research that honestly didn't really exist in any formal way before Milgram. First, respect for persons, which means you have to give informed consent and you have the right to quit at any time. Second, beneficence, which is the duty to do no harm. And third, justice, making sure the burdens and benefits of research are shared fairly.
But the lessons here go way beyond the research lab. Take a look at the Hoffling Hospital experiment from 1966. A researcher posing as a doctor called 22 on-duty nurses and ordered them to give a patient a clear, dangerous overdose of a drug that wasn't even approved. How many of them were about to do it before being stopped? 21 out of 22. That's 95%. It's a bone-chilling, real-world echo of what Milgram found.
And it's because of scary findings like that Milgram's work has had a direct, life-saving impact. In hospitals today, there are speak-up programs that are specifically designed to empower nurses to question a doctor's orders and prevent medical mistakes. And in the military, these findings are used to train officers on exactly when and how they should disobey an unlawful or unethical command.
Which kind of leaves us with one last big thought. Milgram's experiment, when you boil it all down, wasn't just about obedience. It was really about disobedience. It showed the world just how incredibly hard it is to defy authority, even when our own conscience is screaming at us. So the question it leaves for every single one of us is this. In our own lives, in a world full of bosses and rules and hierarchies, how do we find the awareness and maybe the courage to question authority when it really, truly matters?